Most people who start with green buildings make the same mistake, and it takes them years to understand it. So today I'm going to show you how you can avoid making this mistake and save yourself many years. Before we start, for those who don't know who I am, my name is Moin Nodehi, and I am the founder of Biotonomy, one of the leading companies in the world designing and developing green buildings for the past 15 years. So I'm going to show you 5 ways that you can avoid making this mistake. But before I jump into those, I need to explain to you how come people make this mistake. There's a fundamental reason behind this that most people don't understand. So if we look at buildings in general, the life cycle of a building starts with the construction, and after the construction, you have the operation of the building. So the construction of a building can take 1 to couple of years, and then the lifespan of the building can take, between 50 to 100 years, depending on what kind of buildings you're building. And so when we talk about the impact that these buildings have on the environment, another word that is used is the carbon life cycle of the building, which is a complicated term that I'm not going to go into, but the actual impact that the building has on the environment is like this. So during the construction, you are having a 10% of its total impact because of the materials you're using, because of the footprint of the building that you're having on the land, the ecosystems you have to destroy, whatnot. So the actual construction is 10%. And guess what? 90% of its actual impact on the environment comes during the operation of the building. So meaning the way you are heating and cooling the building, the way you are consuming the water, the way you are producing waste, etc. That's the operation part. So the number one mistake I see people do when they get involved in green building is that they focus on the first 10%, which is the actual construction, instead of the 90%, which is where the buildings are having the biggest impact. And so what people do is that during the actual construction, they tend to focus on making the building look as green and sustainable as possible. So choosing natural materials, choosing materials that has a low carbon footprint, and often you see, big companies focusing a lot on this because they're all involved in carbon credits and whatnot. So you basically make the building look green by using all these sustainable materials, which I'm not against. It's great to use materials that has a low impact on the environment. This is how they were actually produced. This is great. But what people forget is the other side, the operation. Very few people who get involved in green buildings learn how to build buildings that operate in a way that not only it doesn't have a negative impact, it actually has a positive impact on the environment. So today I'm going to talk about 5 ways that you can make sure that your green buildings are going to have a positive impact. So, number one is to focus on designing your building to be able to heat and cool itself naturally. For most people, this sounds crazy because they grew up in a world where buildings are constantly being heated and cooled using mechanical solutions like air conditioning, boilers, whatnot. But if you go back into the ancient times, you will see that people actually knew how to build buildings that could produce comfortable temperatures without using electricity, without using fuel, because back in the days, that did not exist. So architects and engineers were forced to think of how to make the buildings comfortable. We tend to think that ancient people were living in their buildings and freezing or overheating, but that's not true. They actually understood how to design buildings to produce comfortable temperatures. And this is a combination of using different design concepts, which are called passive heating and cooling, which is about the type of orientation that you have in your building, that you make sure if you're in a area where heating is of importance, that you maximize the solar gain and you actually store that heat of the sun inside your building, and then that heat is reused later when there's no sun to heat your building. Or the other way around, if you're in an area where cooling is of importance, then you make sure that the orientation of your building is in a way that you minimize the solar intake of your building, and that you also, instead of having to cool the air with mechanical solution, you use physics. So there are ancient cities that still exist today that in the desert that are cooling their buildings and the entire city by using physics instead of using fuel or electricity. And it's very simple. They basically take the hot air from outside and then they channel that air underneath the ground, cool it naturally, because if you go a few meters underneath the ground, you will hit cool temperatures. So you cool the air naturally, and then when the air enters your building, it enters with a comfortable temperature. So what's important to understand is that if you do this, if you make your building heat and cool itself naturally, you've already reduced the energy consumption with up to 80%. 80%. So already by learning how to heat and cool buildings naturally, you're having a huge impact on the environment by reducing this amount of energy consumption. And not only that, your energy bills are going to be 80% less than a conventional building. So that was number one, natural heating and cooling. If you don't understand this, you're not really learning what green buildings is really about. Number two is about designing your building to produce its own water. So most buildings today, if not all buildings, are designed to consume water that comes from your municipal. And where that water comes from? Well, most of the time that water comes from the ground table, which is the water underneath the ground. And cities are today pumping out the water underneath the ground to such a fast pace that cities are actually sinking. There's a lot of research showing this in Mexico, in Middle East. There's a lot of cities around the world that are literally sinking because the water underneath the ground is just keeping getting lower and lower. So there's basically now just air between the water and the ground above it. So slowly it's moving down. And yes, this water is used for agriculture. This water is used for our buildings, for our industries. So the way we are consuming water is having a huge impact because we not only empty the groundwater, we're not putting the water back. So if you want to have impact, if you want to build buildings that actually have a real impact, you need to learn how to design these buildings to produce their own water so they don't rely 100% on the water that is coming from the grid. And the way to do this is to design your roof and the landscape of your building in general to harvest water. Water comes from the sky. And if you have this in mind when you're designing your building, you can actually harvest it. You can store it and you can filter it, and you can filter it all the way so it's clean enough to be drinkable. We do this. The buildings that we produce actually produce its own drinkable water. So people don't rely on municipal water. They don't rely on going to buy water. So the third aspect of it is related to water, and that is the wastewater that our buildings are producing. So most people are not aware of this, but 80% of the sewage of the world that comes out of our building goes untreated. Like, there is no treatment system for it. It literally just goes from toilets directly out to the oceans, to the lakes, to the environments. And this is polluting our environment in a really, really nasty way. And we tend to think that developed countries, that we call developed countries, have a good treatment system, but most of them don't. Their capacities are old, and a lot of them actually are legally allowed to throw their wastewater out because just the infrastructure is not designed to be able to cope with everything, especially now that we have so much floods and rains. More and more sewage are getting out to our environment. So if you really want to learn how to build green buildings, you must design the buildings to treat its own wastewater and then reuse that wastewater. And there's different ways of doing that. Normally, what we do, if it's a new development, we separate what is called gray water, which is the water that comes out of your shower and your sinks. And we also separate the toilet water, which is the wastewater coming out of your toilet, because gray water is much easier to treat. And for both systems, we use a natural way of treating it without using any chemicals or any energy. And this is something the natural world has developed. There are bacteria in combination with the roots of the plants. You can create environments where the sewage can be consumed by bacteria, and that's basically how we treat it naturally. So the way we actually do it is that we design the building so the water is used 4 times. So first, it's used by you for your sanitation. You go, you take a shower, and then that water is automatically reused in a greenhouse where you are producing food. So that's a second time you're using the water. And then that same water is captured again and reused to flush your toilet. So that's the third time you are using the water. And then that toilet water is then treated again naturally and then reused for irrigation in the landscape. So that's the fourth time that we use the water. So if you want to really understand how to build green buildings, it's very important that you design the buildings to reuse 100% of its own wastewater. Now, once you've come to this point, of course, you also have to address energy, because buildings consume energy. But remember, as I told you in number one, natural heating and cooling, you've already reduced your energy consumption with up to 80%. So now you only have another 20% that you need to cover, and that's basically for electricity, for lights, for charging your appliances in your house. And this can easily be done using solar and wind power. These technologies are very well advanced today, and so all buildings around the world can easily, if you have sun, then you use solar panels. If you don't have much sun, you can use wind power, or you can end up combining the two. It depends on where you live, but this is a well-proven technology. And what green buildings that are well designed has of advantage of conventional buildings is that you only need to cover 20% of the energy production compared to a conventional building that needs 100%, because it also uses energy for heating and cooling. Now, the last thing, number 5, is to design your building to actually produce food. Yes, because we humans today rely on supermarkets to survive. So every day or every week, people go to the supermarket, buy groceries, come back home, and consume their food. But why not build an integrated greenhouse inside of your building and produce your own food? And we do this because, as I mentioned earlier, we use plants to treat gray water, which is the water coming out of your showers. So because we use plants to do this, we might as well use edible plants. So we build greenhouses inside of our buildings that help to treat the gray water and at the same time help to produce fruits and vegetables. And you can grow everything from figs, bananas, tomatoes, lettuce, whatever you can imagine, which also makes you self-sufficient on food production. So you don't depend on supermarkets. You are actually able to produce your own fruits and vegetables. And that's really taking it to the next level. So to summarize all of this for you is, once you combine all these 5 solutions, you now have what is called a self-sufficient building, meaning a building that doesn't rely on the municipal's infrastructure to function. It's able to heat and cool itself. It's able to produce its own water. It's able to manage and treat its own wastewater. And it's able to provide with electricity so you can live comfortably in your house with all the modern appliances that you need. And it's also able to produce food for you. Now, if you ask me, that is probably the best investment anyone can make for their own life, but also for their family. Because no matter what happens in the world, if there's a power blackout, you will be inside your home with all the comforts that you need to survive, while the rest of the people are basically freaking out because they have no power. And when there's no power, there's no water because the pumps doesn't work. And when there's no pumps, the sewage system is not going to work. So Conventional buildings collapse when the infrastructure collapses. Buildings that are self-sufficient are able to continue to operate and perform even if the infrastructure is collapsing. And you can see around the world right now what is happening with all the earthquakes, with all the hurricanes, tsunamis, wildfires, extreme heat, extreme cold. All of these weather events are constantly knocking out infrastructures and leaving so many people in their homes without their basic utilities. So once again, if you really want to master green buildings, don't make the mistake of only focusing on using sustainable materials. That is not where the impact is. That is not where you're going to change the future of how we build our buildings and our cities. If you want to have a real impact, you need to learn how to build buildings that are self-sufficient in all the aspects. And this is exactly how the academy is designed, is to teach you all these basic principles of how buildings can be self-sufficient, so you can actually design and build buildings that do not rely on external infrastructure to operate. And in the Academy program, we will share with you real projects that we've developed throughout our 15 years, and you will see in different climates how we did it, how we had to adapt it to extreme warm climates, to cold climates, and to mild climates as well. So the core principles are the same, but for every climate, you need to adapt it so it performs well. So if you really are serious about mastering green buildings, you definitely need to join the Academy, and you need to learn all these principles that makes green buildings become self-sufficient. I look forward to see you inside the Academy.